As you settle into the quiet embrace of night, allow your thoughts to soften. Let the rush of the day dissolve like mist lifting from an ancient riverbank. Now breathe gently and prepare to drift into the distant past, to a world before nations, before kings, to the scattered, vibrant tapestry of the Celtic tribes of Europe. The Celts, a word that stirs visions of swirling symbols, forested hills, fierce warriors, and mystical druids. But who were they truly, and where did they go? Tonight, you will travel through the millennia gently, calmly across the rolling grasslands of Gaul, the misty isles of Britannia, the rugged ridges of the Alps, and beyond. From early Indo-European origins to the fall of their last free kingdoms, the story of the Celtic peoples is one of both myth and memory, of firelit ritual and cultural resilience. The Celts were not a single empire, nor even a single nation. They were a constellation of tribes bound by a shared language family, art styles, belief systems, and ways of life. From Iberia to Anatolia, their presence shaped the face of Europe, only to be slowly obscured by the march of Rome, the rise of Christianity, and the reshaping of history itself. But listen closely, and you may still hear their echoes, in the stone circles of Britain, in the winding knotwork of Irish manuscripts, in the tales of Arthur, Cuchulainn, and Boudica. The Celtic spirit endures. This story begins long before recorded time, in the hazy movements of prehistoric peoples. It unfolds through archaeological layers, linguistic footprints, and classical writings. It glows in torques of gold, hill forts of earth, and the myths passed from bard to bard. We begin, not with swords or kings, but with migration, surly waves of people speaking what scholars call Proto-Celtic, living in villages of timber and thatch, gathering around hearths in a Europe still half forested, half forgotten. Tonight, you'll gently follow their journey. You'll learn of their gods and goddesses, their daily life and dress, their farming and feasting. You'll walk through their marketplaces and mead halls, listen to the rhythms of their poetry, and stand in the shadows of their sacred groves. You'll meet the powerful tribes of Gaul, the warriors of the British Isles, the Celts of the Danube and the Alps. You'll witness their clashes with Rome, their resilience, and the eventual transformation of their world. And, as always, you'll be guided with a soft voice, calm and unhurried as we let the centuries slip past like pages turning in a book made of leaves. There will be no urgency here, no haste, no pressure, just a gentle unfolding. As we move through this long and winding story, you'll notice flowing transitions from place to place, from century to century, always softened to help you drift ever deeper into rest. Each chapter is a candle, quietly lighting the next. We begin with the ancient roots the world before the Celts had a name. Let your breathing slow. Let your mind ease into quiet curiosity. And let the story begin. As we gently open the first chapter in our story, the mists of prehistory part just enough to glimpse the earliest stirrings of the Celtic world. We begin not with ruins, nor with cities, but with movement, quiet, patient migration across the great forests and plains of prehistoric Europe. The year is somewhere around 2500 BCE. Much of Europe is still thick with old-growth woodland, river valleys, and settlements made of wattle and daub. Into this world came waves of Indo-European-speaking people, an ancient language family whose branches would one day bloom into Latin, Greek, Germanic, Slavic, and Celtic. This Proto-Indo-European language, as linguists call it, was not written, but it spread far and wide with its speakers, herders, warriors, and farmers who brought new technologies with them, the horse, the wheel, and metallurgy. By around 1200 BCE, these linguistic branches began to differentiate. One of them evolved into Proto-Celtic, the common ancestor of all Celtic languages we know today. Though no written texts remain, we trace it through careful comparison, word by word, root by root. But language is only one thread. Archaeologists turn to material culture tools, pottery, burial customs, and artwork to trace how the early Celts lived. And here, one of the most important clues comes from the Urnfield culture. Spanning from about 1300 to 750 BCE, the Urnfield people cremated their dead and buried their ashes in hence the name. These people lived in small farming communities spread across Central Europe. They used bronze tools, raised cattle, and organized their settlements in familiar patterns. Many scholars believe they were among the earliest people to speak a form of Proto-Celtic. As we drift into the 8th century BCE, another layer of culture rises from the soil richer, more complex, and unmistakably distinct. This is the Hallstatt culture, named after the lakeside village of Hallstatt in modern Austria, where vast burial grounds revealed a sophisticated, early Celtic society. From about 800 to 450 BCE, Hallstatt was the cultural heartbeat of the early Celts. Its people traded salt, an incredibly valuable commodity in the ancient world. They built hill forts on high ground, commanding the landscape with wooden palisades and earthen ramparts. Within these enclosures were homes, workshops, and places of gathering, early prototypes of the Celtic oppida, or towns, that would come later. In Hallstatt graves, archaeologists find a wealth of material: finely worked bronze swords, delicate amber jewelry, iron tools, and decorated drinking vessels. High-ranking individuals, perhaps chiefs or nobles, were buried in wooden chambers beneath barrows or burial mounds, sometimes alongside chariots and elaborate feasting sets. These graves whisper of a stratified society, where prestige came from warfare, trade, and ritual. Hallstatt art is striking geometric, linear, and influenced by neighboring cultures like the Etruscans and Greeks. And yet, even here, a uniquely Celtic aesthetic begins to emerge. Flowing lines, abstracted animals, intricate symmetry. These would blossom in later centuries into the swirling motifs that still symbolize Celtic culture today. Life in a Hallstatt village was grounded in seasonal rhythms. Families grew wheat and barley, kept pigs and cattle, and crafted goods from bronze and iron. They worshipped local deities, spirits of the land, sky, water, though we know little of their names or stories. The Druids had not yet emerged. This was a world still shrouded in twilight, its myths and rituals mostly lost. Still, through reconstructed roundhouses, carbon-dated tools, and pollen studies from ancient fields, we can imagine their world with quiet clarity. Imagine a morning in Hallstatt. Mist clings to the alpine trees as fires are lit in the roundhouse hearths. A woman weaves linen near the doorway, while children feed pigs in a wooden pen. A man sharpens a sickle before heading to the fields, the smell of damp earth rising with the sun. In the distance, the clatter of carts and the creak of leather harnesses mark the movement of traders. This was not a civilization of great stone monuments or sprawling cities, but of small, self-sufficient communities, richly interlinked. As we drift forward into the 5th century BCE, a transformation begins. The Hallstatt world gradually gives way to something bolder, more expansive. This next phase, the Latin culturae, where the Celts, as we commonly imagine them, truly take form. Named after a lakeside site in Switzerland, Latin culture flourished from about 450 BCE until the Roman conquest. It expanded far beyond the Alpine heartland into Gaul, the British Isles, Iberia, and even as far east as Galatia in modern-day Turkey. Latin society was dynamic and mobile. Their warriors traveled, fought, and traded across great distances. Their metalwork grew more intricate, their art more sinuous and expressive, swirls, spirals, and zoomorphic forms that seem almost alive. And yet, beneath the new flourishes, the old patterns endured. Hill forts remained the centers of life. Kinship, oral tradition, and seasonal festivals still shaped the rhythm of days. Language, too, diversified. By the 4th century BCE, the continental Celtic languages like Gaulish and Lepontic were spoken across much of mainland Europe. Meanwhile, insular Celtic dialects such as Old Irish and Brythonic were developing in the British Isles. Though very few written examples of early Celtic languages survive, mostly inscriptions in Greek or Latin alphabets, we catch glimpses of their words, their names, their worlds. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, refers to the Keltoi, placing them near the source of the Danube. The term likely came from the Celts' own word for themselves, perhaps something like Kelto, meaning the hidden people, or the tribe. To the outside world, they were mysterious, fierce, and foreign. To themselves, they were communities rooted in land and tradition, diverse, but bound by common threads. And now, as this chapter draws to a close, we step gently across a threshold. From the foundational cultures of Hallstatt and Latène, the Celts are ready to spread outward to the far reaches of Europe and into the memory of empire. As we drift onward through time, the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE emerge like a distant morning bright with energy, full of movement. This is the age of Celtic expansion. No longer confined to Central Europe, the Celtic tribes begin to ripple outward west to the ocean, north to the Isles, south to Iberia, and east, astonishingly, all the way to Asia Minor. They were not a conquering empire in the Roman sense. There was no central government, no single ruler. Instead, this was an expansion through migration, trade, intermarriage, and war. A shifting mosaic of peoples who carried their language, beliefs, and way of life into new lands. Let us begin in the west, along the broad green valleys and coastal plains of Gaul modern-day France, Belgium, and parts of Western Germany. By the 4th century BCE, Gaul was a Celtic heartland. Its landscape was dotted with large fortified settlements that served as centers of trade, craftsmanship, and tribal government. These towns, surrounded by walls of stone and timber, often occupied strategic hilltops or river bends. Inside, the rhythm of life was rich and complex. Skilled metalworkers forged iron swords and decorative torques, the thick, twisted necklaces that became symbols of power and identity. Potters crafted painted ceramics. Druids performed seasonal rites in sacred groves. Farmers tended barley, wheat, and cattle, while bards recited lineage and legend around the fire. Gaul was not unified, but divided into dozens of tribes, the Aedui, the Arverni, the Sequani, the Helvetii, and many more, each with its own leaders, alliances, and rivalries. Warfare between tribes was common, but so too was cooperation. Shared language, religion, and cultural norms created a sense of broad, if fragile, identity. South of Gaul, across the Pyrenees, Celtic influence spread into the Iberian Peninsula, especially in the northwest, among the Galaezi and Lusitani tribes of what is now Portugal and Galicia in Spain. These Celtic Iberian peoples developed a distinct blend of Celtic and local traditions. Their hilltop forts called castros offered sweeping views of the valleys below. They carved intricate stone stelae and engaged in fierce resistance when Rome eventually arrived. Moving east, Celtic groups crossed the Alps and settled in northern Italy, establishing powerful city-states and clashing with the rising Roman Republic. One of the most infamous moments of this eastward push came in 390 BCE, when a band of Celts, under the chieftain Brennus, descended on Rome itself. They defeated the Roman army at the Battle of the Allia, entered the city, and demanded a ransom in gold. According to legend, when the Romans protested the unfair weight of the scales, Brennus threw his sword on the balance and declared, "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished. This humiliation seared itself into Roman memory, shaping their future fear and hatred of the Celtic peoples. Further north, Celtic culture spread into the British Isles, in what is now England, Scotland, and Wales, Celtic tribes built roundhouses, erected stone circles, and formed clan-based societies deeply tied to land and ancestry. Their languages, Brittonic and Gaelic, flourished, and many of their oral traditions would later evolve into the mythic cycles of King Arthur and heroic folklore. To the west, in Ireland, the Celts found a refuge, a land of forest and bog, where their culture would survive the Roman conquest and live on into the medieval age. The Irish Celts left behind a deep oral tradition that would eventually be written down in Christian monasteries centuries later, preserving epic tales like the Táin Bó Cúailnge and the Book of Invasions. Meanwhile, to the east, the Celtic expansion reached astonishing distances. By the 3rd century BCE, a coalition of Celtic tribes crossed the Balkans and swept into Greece itself. In 279 BCE, a force of Celts attacked the sanctuary at Delphi, sacred to Apollo. Though ultimately repelled, their campaign was remarkable for its daring. Some of these tribes continued onward, hired as mercenaries or settling new lands. One group migrated across the Hellespont into Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, where they established the region of Galatia. There, Celtic warriors became a permanent presence, even as the Hellenistic world pressed around them. In the city of Ankara modern, Ankara Galatian Celts preserved their language and identity for centuries. Paul the Apostle would later write a letter to the early Christians in this region, the Epistle to the Galatians, addressing a people who still bore the name of their tribal ancestors. Back in Central Europe, Latin culture reached its zenith. Artisans produced masterpieces of design brooches, mirrors, cauldrons, and weaponry that blended fluid, abstract patterns with animal forms. Horses and birds often adorned these pieces, symbolizing freedom, swiftness, and spiritual potency. Religion was deeply intertwined with nature. Celts believed in an animistic world where rivers, trees, and stones were alive with spirit. Certain groves, lakes, and springs were seen as entrances to the otherworld, a parallel realm where ancestors and gods resided. Offerings of swords, torques, and even human remains have been found deposited in these watery sanctuaries. The Druids, though still largely mysterious, were central figures, keepers of sacred knowledge, law, and tradition. They did not write their teachings down, but passed them orally through decades of training. Classical authors like Julius Caesar, Pliny, and Strabo describe them as both priests and judges, mediating disputes and leading sacrifices, though much of this is filtered through Roman eyes. It is important to remember that most of what we know of the Celts comes from outside sources, especially the Greeks and Romans, who often saw them as barbaric or exotic. Yet archaeology tells a more balanced story of skilled craftspeople, organized societies, and vibrant cultural expression. Still, the Celtic world was not without conflict. As tribes spread into contested lands, tensions rose. Competition for resources, long-standing rivalries, and clashes with expanding empires began to strain the edges of the Celtic world. And so, as we near the close of this chapter, a new shadow appears on the horizon, one that would gradually darken the independence of the Celtic peoples. That shadow is Rome. The Roman Republic, once humbled by the Celts, had grown stronger, more organized, more relentless. It would soon return to the lands once occupied by its conquerors, this time not as victims, but as empire builders. But before the conquest, there would be resistance, brave resistance, tribal coalitions, legendary warriors, last stands upon hilltops. That story awaits us in the next chapter. The wind changes, the horizon darkens. As we drift gently into the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, the world of the Celts, so wide, so vital, begins to feel pressure from the south. Rome, once humbled by Celtic raiders, now returns with the force of an empire. This was a new kind of challenge. Unlike tribal skirmishes or seasonal raids, Rome brought roads, legions, taxation, and permanent conquest. And the Celts, for all their diversity and resilience, would face this rising tide in many forms, sometimes divided, sometimes defiant, often heroic. We begin in Gaul. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Roman attention had turned north of the Alps. They had already conquered much of the Mediterranean world and now looked to secure their trade routes and borders. In 121 BCE, the Romans defeated the Arverni and Allobroges tribes, carving out the province of Gallia Narbonensis in southern Gaul. But this was only the beginning. The rest of Gaul, largely autonomous and fiercely tribal, remained independent for nearly a century. It was a land of powerful chieftains, fortified oppida, and roaming druids. Yet beneath the surface, changes were taking place. Roman goods pottery, coins, wine flowed into Celtic markets. Some elites adopted Roman customs, forging alliances through trade and diplomacy. Then came the decisive turn. In 58 BCE, a young and ambitious general named Gaius Julius Caesar was appointed governor of Roman provinces bordering Gaul. Under the pretext of protecting Rome's interests, he launched what would become the Gallic Warsa sweeping campaign to conquer all of Gaul. The Celts resisted. Tribe after tribe mounted defense, sometimes uniting, often falling, divided. Caesar's legions were disciplined, well-equipped, and supported by extensive logistics. The Celts fought with bravery and knowledge of their terrain, but often lacked centralized coordination. The most legendary resistance came in 52 BCE, when a charismatic young chieftain named Vercingetorix of the Arverni tribe managed to unite much of Gaul under his command. Vercingetorix understood that to defeat Rome, the Celts had to act as one. He employed scorched earth tactics, burning crops and towns to deny Caesar's army resources. He harassed Roman supply lines and forced open confrontations on favorable ground. It all culminated in the siege of Alesia, where Vercingetorix and his warriors took refuge in a well-fortified hilltop town. Caesar surrounded the hill with walls, then built a second wall facing outward, preparing for incoming reinforcements. Trapped between the two, the Celts fought desperately. For weeks, they resisted, but hunger and attrition set in. Ultimately, the reinforcements failed to break the siege, and Vercingetorix, in an act of solemn courage, rode out and surrendered to Caesar. He was taken in chains to Rome and years later paraded through the city before his execution. With Alesia, Celtic Gaul was lost. By 50 BCE, nearly all of Gaul had been incorporated into the Roman Empire. The hill forts were repurposed or abandoned. Roman roads, villas, temples, and amphitheaters rose in their place. But this was not the end of Celtic culture. It was a transformation. In many towns, Celtic and Roman traditions blended. Inscriptions honor both Celtic deities and Roman gods side by side. The goddess Epona, protector of horses, was one of the few Celtic figures adopted across the Roman world. Celtic artisans continued to work, now under Roman patronage. Local dialects evolved but endured. In this fusion, a new Gallo-Roman culture emerged, still rooted in the land, but reshaped by empire. Yet, not all the Celtic world fell so quickly. Let us now cross the sea to the British Isles. When Caesar turned his eyes to Britannia in 55 and 54 BCE, he encountered a land of independent tribes and druidic strongholds. His two brief expeditions met resistance from chieftains like Cassivellaunus, and he ultimately withdrew. It would be nearly a century before Rome returned under Emperor Claudius in 43 CE. This time, they came to stay. The conquest of Britain was long and bloody. Tribes like the Catuvellauni, Iceni, and Brigantes resisted with spirit. Some allied with Rome, others fought with fury. In 60 CE, the most famous uprising erupted. After the death of her husband, the Roman client king Prasutagus, the Iceni queen Boudica rose against Roman rule. Roman officials had seized her lands, flogged her, and assaulted her daughters. In response, Boudica led a fiery revolt. With flaming hair and a chariot pulled by wild horses, Boudicca's army swept through Roman towns, destroying Camulodunum, Verulamium, and even Londinium. Tens of thousands perished, but Roman discipline prevailed. Governor Suetonius Paulinus regrouped his legions and defeated Boudicca's forces in a pitched battle. She is said to have taken her own life, choosing death over capture. Though her revolt failed, Boudica became a symbol of Celtic defiance of dignity in the face of conquest. Further north, in the rugged highlands of Scotland, the Romans met the Caledonians' fierce tribes who fought from the forests and mountains. Rome built a massive wall, Hadrian's Wall, to mark the northern edge of their empire. Beyond it lay unconquered lands, untamed and mysterious. Meanwhile, in Ireland, the Romans never came. There, the Celtic way of life endured without direct imperial rule. Tribal kings, warrior poets, and druids flourished. Monasteries would later preserve this heritage in writing long after it had vanished from the continent. And so, the Roman conquest reshaped the Celtic world, but it did not erase it. Let us now turn east once more, to Galatia. In the heart of Anatolia, the Galatian Celts remained distinct into the Roman era. Their warriors served as mercenaries. Their leaders maintained local rule under Roman oversight. Over time, they adopted Greek and Roman customs, yet their Celtic roots persisted. In a curious moment of history, the Apostle Paul, writing to the Galatians in the New Testament, addressed a Celtic-descended people Christian in faith, but tribal in memory. This blending of identities, Roman and Celtic, pagan and Christian, defined the final centuries of Celtic autonomy. By the 3rd century CE, most Celtic lands had been Romanized. Druids had been suppressed. The old Oppida had fallen silent. Latin was the language of law, religion, and empire. Yet beneath the surface, the spirit endured. Celtic myths continued in song. Local festivals retained ancient roots. Landscapes still bore sacred meaning. The people remembered. And when Rome began to crumble in the west, when legions withdrew and cities declined, it was in Celtic lands that new voices rose. Christian monks in Ireland, Wales, and Scotland would become the keepers of history, learning, and legend. The next chapter will explore this legacy. As the power of Rome wanes in the west, the story of the Celts enters a new and quieter phase. This is no longer a tale of wide migrations or fierce resistance, but of survival quiet, steady, and deeply rooted in place. With the collapse of Roman authority in the 5th century CE, Europe entered what many once called the Dark Ages. But in the lands where Celtic culture endured, the light of tradition continued to flicker. Indeed, in some places, it shone brighter than ever before. Nowhere is this more vivid than in the insular Celtic world, in the British Isles, and especially in Ireland. Ireland, never conquered by Rome, became a refuge for Celtic identity. Its tribes, kingdoms, and spiritual traditions had evolved without imperial interference, and now, after the fall of Rome, they blossomed into something new. The transformation began with the arrival of Christianity. In the 5th century, missionaries like St. Patrick brought Christian teachings to Ireland. But rather than destroy the native Celtic traditions, this new faith wove itself into them, adopting their rhythms and imagery. Irish monasteries rose across the landscape, quiet centers of faith, learning, and preservation. Places like Clonmacnoise, Kells, and Glendalough became sanctuaries not only of religion, but of memory. Here, monks copied not only Christian texts, but also Celtic oral tales, myths, genealogies, and poetry, often reworking them in Christianized forms, but preserving their essence. The Book of Kells, with its elaborate interlaced artwork and sacred calligraphy, is perhaps the most famous product of this Celtic Christian synthesis. What had once been oral became written. Myths like the Ulster Cycle and the mythological cyclotales of Cuchulainn, Medb, the Tuatha De Danann, and the magical otherworld were finally set down, fusing heroic pagan past with Christian present. These stories tell of heroes who fight with divine weapons, of shape-shifting druids, of love and betrayal, of kings who must rule with justice or lose the favor of the land itself. And always, beneath the surface, we sense an older worldview, a belief in the sacredness of nature, the cycles of time, and the thin veil between this world and the next. In Wales, too, the Celtic flame endured. The Mabinogion, a collection of prose tales compiled in the medieval period, contains echoes of pre-Christian Celtic mythology. It speaks of enchanted cauldrons, prophetic dreams, noble quests, and queens with mysterious power. One of these tales, the story of Pwyll, Prince of Dyfed, tells of a man who swaps places with a ruler of the otherworld and must earn his place through wisdom and honor. In the far north, in Scotland, Celtic identity persisted through the Picts, and later the Gaels of Dalriada. And in Brittany, across the sea in what is now northwest France, Celtic culture took root in exile. Here, Breton emerged, a Celtic language closely related to Cornish and Welsh carried by migrants fleeing Saxon invasions in Britain. To this day, Brittany maintains a proud Celtic identity, with festivals, music, and language revival movements. Thus, even as much of continental Europe lost its direct connection to Celtic speech and customs, the insular Celtic lands preserved them through a unique synthesis of tradition and transformation. Language, in particular, remained a key marker of continuity. The Goidelic branch comprising Irish, Scottish Gaelic, and Manx remained vibrant in the West. The Brittonic branch, including Welsh, Cornish, and Breton, endured in the East and South. These languages, though now endangered in many regions, contain within them echoes of ancient grammar, cosmology, and cultural memory. Consider a single word from Old Irish, anamcara, literally, soul friend. It refers to a spiritual companion, a mentor or confidant in the Christian monastic tradition. But the word blends older Celtic notions of kinship and spiritual connection with newer Christian ideals. In these linguistic survivals, we hear the whisper of centuries. Music, too, carried memory. The haunting strains of Celtic harp, the keening of Sean No's singing, the rhythmic patterns of Bodhran drumsall preserve emotional textures that reach back into pre-Christian ritual and storytelling. Over time, the Druidic order itself faded into legend. Suppressed by Rome, replaced by Christian clergy, the Druids were transformed from living figures into symbols, keepers of arcane wisdom, guardians of the old ways. But their memory persisted. In Irish poetry, the figure of the Fili, or poet-seer, became the heir to Druidic insight, someone who could speak truth, curse kings, and call down the past through verse. In medieval tales, the other world so central to pre-Christian belief remained vivid. It was a place of beauty and peril, of timelessness and magic. A place entered through mists, lakes, or hollow hills. Neither heaven nor hell, but something older, a mirror of the world, alive with mystery. Thus, the Celts did not vanish. They changed. Their gods became saints. Their festivals became feasts. Samhain, once the night when the veil between worlds was thinnest, became All Hallows' Eve, or Halloween. Imbolc, a spring rite honoring the goddess Brigid, became St. Brigid's Day. Beltane and Lugnasad, marking summer's height and harvest, remained in folk memory long after their religious meanings faded. This process, called syncretism, is not erasure, but evolution, a blending of the sacred old with the meaningful new. As the Middle Ages deepened, Celtic identity expressed itself in resistance to external pressures, not only Roman, but now Saxon, Viking, and later Norman. And yet, through these centuries, something persisted. A distinct worldview, a reverence for land, ancestry, and memory. Monastic scribes in stone cells, peasant families at hearthside, poets weaving old names into new stories. They all kept the thread unbroken. By the 12th century, Celtic lands had once again become frontiersmen, the edge of larger kingdoms, empires, and church reforms. But in places like Ireland, Wales, and the Scottish Highlands, a deep and living Celtic culture still pulsed. And it is here, in the quiet of the medieval world, that the Celtic story enters a long twilight. Not extinction, not silence, but preservation. A sleeping memory, waiting to awaken. As we drift gently into the modern age, the Celtic world long quiet, long obscured, begins to stir once more. The centuries between the 12th and 18th were marked by conquest and assimilation. The Celtic-speaking regions of Europe were gradually absorbed into expanding kingdoms, Ireland into England, Scotland into Great Britain, Wales under English crown, and Brittany into France. Cornwall, too, experienced political and linguistic decline. During this time, many Celtic languages retreated, oral traditions faded, folklore was dismissed as superstition, hill forts lay overgrown, their stories buried under turf and time. But in the stillness, memory lingered. And then, in the 18th and 19th centuries, something remarkable happened. Across Europe, a romantic movement took hold, a cultural reawakening that sought inspiration not from the rationalism of Enlightenment thinkers, but from nature, myth, and the imagined purity of ancient peoples. Artists, poets, and historians turned their gaze to the so-called forgotten cultures of the past. The Celts' mysterious, poetic, tribal captivated this romantic imagination. Writers rediscovered fragments of Celtic poetry, sometimes real, sometimes imagined. One of the most influential and controversial figures was James Macpherson, a Scottish poet who, in the 1760s, published a series of epic works said to be translations of ancient Gaelic bards. The most famous among them was Ossian, a legendary warrior poet. Though many scholars now regard these as creative inventions rather than faithful translations, they sparked immense interest across Europe. Napoleon, Goethe, and Wordsworth all read and admired the Ossianic poems. In Ireland, antiquarians began to gather and publish local folklore, laying the groundwork for a deeper understanding of Gaelic heritage. The 19th century brought more scholarly rigor to these efforts. Archaeologists began to excavate hill forts, crannogs, and megalithic tombs. Linguists analyzed surviving Celtic languages, tracing their evolution and interrelations. A broader idea took shape of the Celtic race, often romanticized as noble, intuitive, close to nature, and resistant to imperial domination. This was not always historically accurate, but it captured the mood of the time. The Celts became symbols not just of the past, but of identity, especially in lands where cultural survival was a form of resistance. In Wales, this spirit took form in the revival of Eisteddfod photo-ancient bardic festivals, reimagined for a modern audience. Poetry competitions, music, and ceremony celebrated the Welsh language and history. In Ireland, the 19th century witnessed the rise of the Gaelic revival. Figures like Douglas Hyde, Lady Gregory, W.B. Yeats, and John Millington Synge sought to reclaim Irish mythology, folklore, and language. Their efforts helped spark both a literary renaissance and a political awakening, contributing to the movement for Irish independence. The Irish Literary Theatre, which later became the Abbey Theatre, brought stories of Cuchulainn, Deirdre, and the Tuatha De Danann to the stage. The myths once whispered in monastic scriptoria now resounded in modern cities. Language revival efforts began in earnest. Schools taught Irish Gaelic. Newspapers published in it. Cultural organizations like the Gaelic League promoted its use in everyday life. In Scotland, the Highland Sunts, suppressed after the Jacobite risings, also saw renewed pride in Gaelic language, dress, and identity. Tartan, clan crests, and bagpipes became symbols of a distinct cultural past. In Brittany, the Breton language and music experienced a revival as locals asserted their unique heritage within the French Republic. And in Cornwall, efforts began to reintroduce the nearly extinct Cornish language through poetry, signage, and education. These movements were not just about nostalgia, they were about survival. To speak a Celtic language in the modern world was to reclaim dignity, to resist assimilation, to remember. The artistic side of this revival also flourished. Celtic knotwork, spirals, and motifs from the Book of Kells found their way into jewelry, architecture, and graphic design. Composers like Edward Elgar, Arnold Bax, and Granville Bantock wrote music inspired by Celtic legend and landscape. Painters captured windswept moors, enchanted forests, and heroes bathed in golden light. Even J.R.R. Tolkien, though a scholar of Germanic languages, drew inspiration from Celtic myths in shaping Middle-earth. The idea of the otherworld, of a mystical realm just beyond the edge of perception, reappeared in art and literature. Fairies, once feared, became figures of charm and enchantment. The old gods, now called fair folk or Sidhe, danced in poetry and song. At the same time, modern scholarship worked to separate myth from history. Archaeologists carefully dated burial sites and settlements. Linguists traced patterns of sound change in surviving languages. Historians analyzed Roman sources critically, aware of their biases. Together, the scholarly and artistic revivals created a rich, if sometimes contradictory, tapestry. The Celtic world became a space of cultural imagination and historical inquiry, something to be studied, celebrated, and, for many, reclaimed. As we move into the 20th and 21st centuries, the Celtic revival becomes not just artistic or academic, but political. In Ireland, independence brought new emphasis on national culture. Though challenges remained, the Irish state supported language education, literature, and heritage preservation. In Scotland and Wales, devolution of powers from the UK government allowed for greater support of regional identity. Parliaments and assemblies debated in both English and Celtic tongues. Even in Cornwall, where the language had once nearly disappeared, official recognition and cultural pride grew. In Brittany, despite centralizing pressures from the French state, regional identity held strong. Celtic identity also found expression in the diaspora. Across the Atlantic, in Canada, the United States, and Australia, people of Irish, Scottish, and Welsh descent celebrated their heritage through festivals, music, and storytelling. St. Patrick's Day, once a solemn religious feast, became a global expression of Irish pride. Highland Games, Keelids, and Breton Fest Nose events brought traditional dance and music to new generations. At the same time, modern Celtic spirituality began to emerge. Some sought to reconstruct ancient pagan beliefs, drawing on druidic ideas, reverence for nature, and seasonal cycles. These modern neo-druid or Celtic pagan movements are diverse, often blending historical knowledge with new interpretations. They are not direct continuations of ancient religions, but they speak to a desire deep and human to reconnect with something old, sacred, and rooted in the earth. Today, Celtic culture exists in many forms, in language spoken, sung, and taught anew, in myth or told, reimagined, and performed, in music and art inspired by symbols older than writing, in place names, stone circles, and the soft sound of wind over heathered hills, and perhaps, most of all, in memory. A memory not of a single empire or ruler, but of tribes and bards, of rituals beneath oak trees, of roundhouses warmed by firelight. A memory of people who lived with the land, who spoke to its spirits, and who sang their stories into the bones of the earth. As we gently arrive at the closing pages of this long, ancient story, we find ourselves not at an ending, but at a quiet continuity. The Celtsas, a people, as an idea never truly vanished. Though their great hill forts now lie in ruin, and their warriors and druids no longer walk the earth, their spirit lingers, woven into the fabric of modern Europe and beyond. Today, 6 regions are recognized as the heartlands of Celtic heritage: Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Brittany, Cornwall, and the Isle of Man. These are known collectively as the Celtic nations. In each of them, the echoes of ancient languages, traditions, and beliefs persist. Let us drift briefly through each. In Ireland, the Irish language Gaelgeis, spoken natively in parts of the West and taught widely across the island. Street signs are bilingual. Traditional music flourishes in pubs and festivals. Folklore still pulses through rural storytelling, and sacred sites like Newgrange and Tara are revered as national treasures. In Scotland, Gaedhlig survives in the Highlands and Western Isles. The ancient clan system, though no longer political, lives on in family pride and tartan patterns. The haunting notes of the great Highland bagpipe carry across moors that once bore the footsteps of Celtic warriors and saints. In Wales, the Cymraeg language thrives as a symbol of resilience. Welsh schools, television, and radio stations support its daily use. The Eisteddfod, a festival of poetry and song, celebrates the bardic traditions of old. The red dragon of Cadwallader, a mythical symbol, flies proudly on the national flag. In Brittany, despite pressure from centralizing French policies, the Breton language and culture hold strong. Traditional music lively and hypnoticis played on instruments like the bombarde and biniou. Villages still celebrate fest noz, night festivals filled with dancing echoing ancient communal rituals. In Cornwall, the Cornish language, once declared extinct, has returned. It is taught in schools, used in signage, and spoken by passionate revivalists. The spirit of Tintagel, Bodmin Moor, and Arthurian legend surrounds the landscape, filled with windswept mystery. And on the Isle of Man, the Manx language has risen from silence, brought back by determined families and cultural leaders. Its rhythms, once nearly lost, now sing again in classrooms and ceremonies. These 6 nations are not bound together by politics or empire. They are connected by memory, by the persistence of a worldview that sees land as sacred, story as power, and the past not as lost, but as living. Beyond Europe, in the Celtic diaspora, millions claim heritage from these lands. In North America, Australia, and beyond, communities gather to share music, dance, and stories. Highland Games, St. David's Day, and Imbolc celebrations fill parks and halls with a sense of belonging. These gatherings are more than nostalgia. They are threads in a tapestry that continues to grow. In recent decades, modern Celtic identity has become fluid and inclusive. One does not need fluent Irish or a Gaelic surname to feel connected. It is enough to walk a stony beach in Kerry and feel the wind whisper in your ear, or to read a verse of early poetry and hear the voice of a bard long gone. For scholars, the Celtic world remains a fertile field of discovery. New archaeological finds burial sites, jewelry, weapons, and structure help deepen our understanding. DNA studies reveal patterns of migration and mixture. Linguistic analysis sharpens the picture of how Celtic languages evolved and spread. We now understand that the Celts were not a single unified people, but a rich network of cultures sharing language and spiritual ideas. They were farmers, artisans, warriors, poets. Their gods had many names, and their stories many forms. Their world was one of fluidity, of sacred landscapes, of cycles of time and nature, and this worldview continues to inspire. In an age of fast change and digital pace, many look back to Celtic ideas of balance between earth and sky, community and individual, history and imagination. Modern environmental movements sometimes draw from Celtic respect for nature. Writers craft novels that reweave ancient myths into new tales. Musicians blend traditional instruments with modern styles to create haunting, timeless soundscapes. In spiritual circles, Neo-Druidism, Celtic Christianity, and earth-based practices seek to honor the old wisdom while walking forward in modern shoes. And still, the stories endure. The Tuatha De Danann, the Shining Ones, Bran the Blessed, sailing to distant isles. Macha, who outran kings. Cuchulainn, the Hound of Ulster. Taliesin, bard and shapeshifter. Deirdre of the Sorrows, the tragic beauty. The Salmon of Knowledge, the Tree of Life, the Cauldron of Rebirth. These tales whisper through books, games, films, and dreams. They ask us to listen to the land, to the past, to the silence between the words. So as we close this long and gentle journey, take a moment to breathe. Let the images settle in your mind. A misty valley, a flickering hearth, a spiral carved in stone, children learning forgotten words, elders passing tales beside the fire, the rhythm of a drum echoing in the hills, a harp string trembling in the twilight. The Celts are not gone. They live in the stories we tell, the languages we revive, the music we hum without knowing why. They live in the heather on the moor, the patterns in the stone, and the way our hearts still turn toward the west, where the sun slips beyond the sea. And so, dear listener, as you drift into rest, may the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the stories of the Celts guide your dreams tonight, as softly and as surely as a bard's last song. Good night.